Hola, I'm Robert Martinez, State Historian of New Mexico. This is New Mexico History in 10 minutes. By the mid 1800s, New Mexico was a territory of the United States. We had fought two Civil War battles. We were fighting for statehood, and we were wrestling as parts of the United States had been slave holding states. Others were free. New Mexico was free. We did not have black slavery. However, there was still pressure on the Navajo and Apache people who were enslaved. They were put into households as slaves and servants under the guise of adoption. So this was still going on in New Mexico into the late 1800s and early 1900s. Things were going to change for New Mexico, though, because by 1878, the first locomotive moved south from the area of Raton Pass from Colorado into New Mexico. This was a revolutionary technological change that would radically alter New Mexico forever. Uh, the locomotive comes in around December of 1878, and then your first passenger trains start to come to New Mexico in 1879. We need to recognize that work on the railroad, on the tracks and moving equipment, it was a huge operation that was crisscrossing the nation, the North American continent, and changing people, populations, and cultures everywhere. But it was coming from many directions. This is when we start to see a lot of Chinese immigrants coming to New Mexico. They're also going to other parts of the United States, to the West Coast, to the Midwest, and they're working and becoming Americans. But they also face discrimination. Laws are put in place to stop Chinese immigration. They're very radically racist laws. But nonetheless, this is part of the American story. Native Americans and Mexicans are also involved in the construction of the railroad, as are white Americans, black Americans. Everyone is working and contributing to this new technology. In New Mexico, it's interesting to see these lines crisscross our state. They establish new towns in places like Las Vegas and Bernalillo and Albuquerque, and then Las Cruces in southern New Mexico, and other towns. In fact, little towns start to spring up all around the railroad tracks because they're places of business and commerce. Uh, Materials start to pour into New Mexico: lumber, livestock, goods from back east, things that will change the diet, but also our culture. Tin starts to come into New Mexico, and this creates a new art form, tin artwork in New Mexico. So it changes a lot of things. The population starts to change. A lot of people of Northern European background start to come on the train. People that used to come on the Santa Fe Trail now are arriving by the train load. And they're bringing things like architecture. For centuries, we had our Puebloan and adobe architecture, an ancient way of constructing buildings, churches, civil edifices. But now we start to see American materials, brick and pitched roofs come to New Mexico. So if you go to places like Albuquerque or Las Vegas, you can still see the old town, the Plaza Vieja. That's where the old first colonial, then Spanish and Mexican towns were. And then just a few blocks away where the train tracks are, you see the new town springing up, businesses, stores, Protestant churches, Jewish synagogues, and temples of different types of worship being built in these places. And you could see it in the street names. You don't see Spanish language street names. You see places that have street names like Walter and Edith, named for politicians' children. And it starts to change how the towns and cities of New Mexico look as well. Interestingly, the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad didn't go through Santa Fe. The closest it got was at Lamy, about 18 miles outside of Santa Fe. Eventually, a line was constructed in the early to mid 1800s to Santa Fe. Then the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad could only go as far south as Española. So a line had to be constructed from Española to Santa Fe, and this would eventually be called the Chile line because of all the ristras of Chile you could see hanging from houses when people would ride on these trains. So as you can imagine, New Mexico was being crisscrossed by rail lines, by tracks, and it was really a technological innovation that would change everything. It's amazing to look at photos from the time period. You see famous people coming to New Mexico. Teddy Roosevelt, Mary Pickford, all kinds of movie stars and politicians start to make their way to places like Santa Fe, Las Vegas, and Albuquerque because now it's a lot easier to come to this exotic place called New Mexico. Bernalillo was originally going to be the center of rail activity in the area of Albuquerque, but eventually a land dispute forced a move to Albuquerque, which turned our city here, where I live, into the biggest city, first town, and then city in New Mexico. And this is the period in the 1860s, around the 1860s, that we lose our R in Albuquerque. It used to be Albuquerque, Alburquerque. And we still say it like that in Spanish. My parents, I always remember hearing them talk. They would say Alburquerque, but then later on, during the American territorial period, we become Albuquerque. I've looked at church records, Catholic marriages and baptisms, and it's in the 1860s that you start to see priests writing Albuquerque with the R missing. Another aspect of the railroad that ultimately will bring a lot of people here is the tuberculosis epidemic. People start to come to places like New Mexico and Arizona because of our climate. It's just easier to breathe. It's healthier. It still is, by the way. But this is where you have lungers coming to New Mexico to live in a healthier climate. So as you can imagine, the railroad just radically changes New Mexico. The population changes. It goes from being predominantly Hispano and Mexican in the mid 1800s to being by 1900, the Pueblo population and the Hispano population are overtaken by Americans coming from the East, Americans of all racial and ethnic backgrounds, people of Northern European, Southern European, Black, African, Jewish, Muslim, Middle Eastern people start to come from places like Lebanon, all the way from the other side of the world to the east coast of the United States, then making their way to New Mexico. So this is what New Mexico will be experiencing from about 1879 until we get to statehood around 1912, and then we'll start to see another kind of transportation change New Mexico, the airplane. But until then, it's the railroad. It's the railroad that's going to be changing the landscape of New Mexico, the demographic landscape, the economy, and culture of New Mexico. The Chile line ran from about 1887 to 1941, but we still have the railroad. Amtrak runs, and other rail lines are bringing goods and materials and people to New Mexico and out of New Mexico as well. So that's the story of how New Mexico is radically changed by the railroad, a very important and significant event in New Mexico's history. Thank you. Please join me for more episodes of New Mexico History in 10 minutes. Goodbye. Hasta pronto.